Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that. But it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors. I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutors Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutors Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my relieved co-host, Brett.
So relieved, Alice. I can't even tell you how relieved I am. And this is something, obviously, we're talking about the Delphi case. We've been waiting now 4 days while the jury deliberated. But, this has really been a wait that's been going on since 2017. And this is a case that I think means a lot to so many people because of the innocence that was taken here and what it represented. And it's a case that meant a lot to us. It's one that we covered very early on. Honestly, I think it was the first case we did well. I like to tell people that. And having had the opportunity to meet the families, I just ached for them and what they were going through. And I can't imagine what they've gone through these last 7 years and these last couple years since Richard Allen was arrested. And now to finally have a verdict in the case is really, it's hard to describe what they must be going through.
Absolutely. We were asked last year, I think, what is one case you would like solved? This was before there was an arrest. And I think both of us said the Delphi case. For those of you who are just tuning in the last couple of minutes, the jury has come back with a verdict on all 4 counts guilty. Richard Allen is guilty of the murders of Liberty German and Abby Williams. And this is such a relief because if you've been following this case, yes, while the trial's been 3 weeks long, which is a lengthy trial, sure, in any sense, but it is the circus surrounding this case that has led to where we are today. And I know many of you have been holding with bated breath because we have said before the prosecution presented a very clean, very tight, very evidentiary-based timeline to show that Richard Allen was guilty of these murders. But there was a lot of noise in the YouTube and Reddit world, sparked with conspiracies devoid of evidence that should have had no bearing in the courtroom. And today we get to say that it seems that justice has been done, that the noise that is devoid of evidence has not made its way into the jury deliberation room. And they delivered, I think, what is a just and very defensible verdict.
Yeah, and let's talk about that briefly. One thing I would say to everybody out there, whatever your personal views are on this case, respect the jury and respect their decision. We were talking in the chat, one of the chats on the gallery while we were waiting on the verdict. And one of the things I said was, if it's a not guilty verdict, I will be at peace with it. Because if 12 people came together, looked at the evidence, weighed it, and said, sorry, the state just didn't get there, that's something, that's our system. And it's something that I would not have been happy with, I would have disagreed with, but it's something I would have respected. And I think instead, you had 12 jurors who saw all this evidence, who were in the court every day, who came in with no agenda, No preconceived notions. Money wasn't on the line for them. It didn't matter which way this came out. This wasn't about ratings for them. This was about finding justice. And they deliberated for 4 days. They started on Thursday. They worked on Friday and Saturday. Yesterday was a day where I bet all 12 of them, while they had the day off, were thinking through this case. They came together today and essentially, after probably about 3 or 4 hours of deliberating, came to this verdict. And I think it's something that we should respect, and it's a testament to the jury system and how we do things in this country. That's how we make decisions, not based on tweets or based on, what podcaster has the most listeners. The second thing I'll say, Alice said a defensible case. One thing people are always concerned about are the appeals. I'm an appellate lawyer. I'm a criminal appellate lawyer. I can tell you a couple things for sure. Number one, there will not be a successful ineffective assistance of counsel claim in this case. It's not going to happen. There were people throughout the trial that worried about that because of various criticisms of the defense team. Understand, criticizing the defense team doesn't mean they're ineffective. It doesn't mean they're incompetent. As a matter of fact, if what you say is, man, if it were me, I would have done this thing, you automatically lose that because that's a strategic or a tactical decision, and those are completely in the discretion of the defense. So their decision to go with a someone took the girls away theory is not something that will ever be ineffective. So even if you think they should have just tried to poke holes, why didn't they do that? It'll never be ineffective. Ineffective would be something like, think of the Adnan Syed case. Someone comes to you and says, hey, your client, I have an ironclad alibi for them. I was with them the whole time. You should put me on the stand. And you're just like, whatever. And you don't put them on the stand. Your guy's found guilty. And then it comes out later on that you knew this, or should have known about this, should have investigated this, should have looked into it. That would be ineffective. Now, if you looked into it and said, I don't think that person is credible, which incidentally is probably what happened in the Adnan Syed case. If you do that, that is not ineffective. That, once again, is a strategic decision. There is nothing the defense did in this case that will undermine this conviction. Alice, I don't know if you have an opinion on that or not.
No, I think that's exactly right. Look, we've always said trials are live beings. There's not a script that everyone follows. That's what makes trials so exciting, and it's also why a lot of defendants decide to go to trial, because it is not a pre-roll of the dice. You don't actually know what witnesses will say on the stand. You have a good idea because you've probably interviewed them, you have reports to go off of, but they are live human beings responding to real live questions and real live cross-examinations. And because of that, lawyers are having to make strategic decisions every second of every trial, which is why ineffective assistance of counsel is such a high bar. Because if we take away the ability of lawyers to make strategic decisions during trial, you essentially take away the tool of the lawyer. Think about a composer. A composer, if you say you have to create a symphony in 4/4 time with these 4 notes in this exact pattern every time, you're not going to get creativity. You're not going to get a symphony. That's what trial work is like. It is more an art than a science. And so when someone says that's an effective assistance of counsel, think, is there any strategy within that? Are there multiple reasons for why an attorney who knows the full display of information would make a decision different than what you think is right? Layperson who is sitting on Reddit, watching from afar. And so be wary of those types of claims. There's a reason that they're filed all the time, because it sounds great and doesn't mean there aren't real meritorious ineffective assistance of counsel claims. There is not one here. Judge Gull was very careful. She made most of her decisions erred on the side of incredibly conservative, in the sense of there was an arguable way she could have let some of the things that she kept out in by the prosecution. She did that to appeal-proof the case. She did this because she didn't want to give an inch to the appeal process. She wanted to play. She was, in fact, I would say, unfair to the prosecution in order to appeal-proof this case. Her decisions were not all over the board. They were not reckless. If anything, they actually constrained the prosecution more so than the defense. And that is a strategy a lot of judges want to do because they'd rather be safe than sorry. And I think we see this in this case because Judge Gull came ready. She knew exactly what was going to happen. She knows that an appeal is going to be coming because they already mandamused her. This is an extreme case. Very few cases go up to a state Supreme Court through mandamus and then go back for a trial court. This whole entire procedural posture of this case has been extraordinary. And Judge Gull is an experienced chief judge of this court and knows what she's doing, knew what kind of lawyer she was dealing with, and decided to play it very safe with respect to the appeals process.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about that as far as the future appeal. Number one, most appeals fail. The vast majority fail. So you're already up against it. So they're going to have what's called a direct appeal, and that will go to whatever the Indiana appeals courts are. Their main claim will be their third-party liability claim. We did an entire episode on this. Listen to that episode, and you will hear why that will fail. Their third-party Odinism claim is incredibly weak. And Judge Gull, as Alice said, Judge Gull learned something from kicking them off. Number one, at the time, it irritated me that they got back on. Now I'm really glad they did, because that's another issue that's off, right? So, like, that issue is dead. He got the lawyers he wanted. That issue is dead and gone. And as a matter of fact, any ineffective claim for leaking the photos, also dead and gone, because he's waived that. So we're good on that issue.
And remember, the court that ruled on these is the court that would be ultimately hearing the very end of these appeals, the Indiana Supreme Court. They jumped all the way to the Indiana Supreme Court. Not every case, before trial, before verdict gets to go all the way to the Indiana Supreme Court. So they've already known and seen how this is all played out. And that's who would be hearing these appeals ultimately if they decide to, go all the way there.
The other thing the Indiana Supreme Court has already ruled on, I think multiple times at this point, is that Judge Gull was not a biased jurist. The defense, they kept trying to remove her, so they have now made their arguments. It's law of the case that she wasn't biased against them. They made those arguments, they were rejected, so that's gone. So you have the Odinism thing. Well, as I was saying, she learned something from that whole removing the lawyers, because what did she do there? She did what I think was legally defensible. She removed them because of their incompetence, because they were in contempt of court through their incompetence, because they allowed these photographs to leak that now, by the way, are all over the internet. So, but what did she not do? She didn't have a hearing. She didn't make a record. That is not the case with the Odinism theory. She had a 3-day hearing where the defense was able to put on the best they could for Odinism. And the prosecution was able to cross-examine their witnesses, where a record was created. So now you can see exactly what they would have put before the jury, and it fell absolutely flat. They could not put any of the people that they said were involved at the scene. They couldn't break through the ironclad alibi of their chief witness. All they had were some officers who initially investigated this angle that never went anywhere. That is a loser. They're going to lose on that. I will be stunned if they get any traction whatsoever on the third party stuff. I mean, number one, this is an evidentiary decision by the judge. There's going to be some discretion there, and you have to weigh it against the evidence that we have. So you have Odinism up against all the evidence that was presented at trial. It is an incredibly high hurdle for this defense team to try and cross with the Odinism theory.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, like we said, Judge Gull learned from the first instance when she kicked off this defense team. Remember, we'd been really hard on her. We said that decision seemed to be made behind doors without a record. And if that had stayed the case, I do think there are some appeal points that would have been appealing or made me a little bit nervous once a verdict was reached. But this is the key, what Brett just said, that 3-day hearing. We have it all on record. This isn't going to be a situation where we find some new witness 20 years later. We get to revisit the case like in the Adnan Syed case. They had everything at their fingertips. That was essentially their best trial case. And it's all before any future appellate court in that record to see. And because Judge Gull was the one to oversee it, remember, we've always said the district court judge who hears the witnesses, who is actually in the room, able to assess the credibility of witnesses. There's a reason those factual findings are given. There's a lot of weight given to them because that's the judge sitting in the room. It's very different than reading cold, hard words on a paper. And so she's made that record. It is the record forever to be revisited in the future. Whatever they find in the future, they have to contend with this 3-day record that didn't exist before all of the removal stuff, by the way. So I think what ended up being an amazing silver lining with respect to appeal proofing this case.
And some people are asking about requesting a directed verdict. In some states, I don't practice in Indiana, so I'm not sure what their practice is. In some states, you don't do that until after a guilty verdict, and you do it in writing. So what I would expect to see is at some point between now and the sentencing, which will be in December, the defense will file a brief which will ask for directed verdict, not guilty. They'll make their arguments for why the state didn't meet its burden, and that will be their claim. And then it will be denied by Judge Galt, and that is sort of the vehicle for the appeal that would go up after that.
And here's the thing with the directed verdict. Yes, it's like you ask for it in every case, but in all of our legal briefs, we've explained to you, typically when there's appeal cases, you have to also show prejudice. So let's say that they don't ask for a directed verdict in this case at all. And maybe there's case law saying if you don't ask for it, it's ineffective. It could be ineffective. Then what you do is you look at the fact that they didn't ask for directed verdict, if that is in fact the case, we don't know yet. And then you look at the record. And the appeals court gets to say, well, this is overwhelming evidence that supports a guilty verdict. So even though they should have asked for a directed verdict, there's no prejudice here because no judge, no reasonable judge with this sort of record would ever grant a directed verdict. So bad job, attorneys. You really should have asked for it, but it wouldn't have made a difference. And we're not going to redo everything. This is not a court of technicality. This is a court of equity.
Another thing they'll claim is that the appeal or the confessions never should have came in because they were coerced. The problem for them there is they didn't really make that argument very effectively initially, number one. Number two, even if they had, he was never coerced. Like none of these confessions occurred in what you would expect, sort of a interrogation, custodial situation. So really, the attack on them is exactly the attack they used, which is to say, look, because of his conditions of confinement, messed with his head, he said these things, but they weren't real. They were all made up. I mean, that was a legitimate attack that they presented to the jury. The jury obviously rejected that. And this is another important thing when you're thinking about the appeal. Appeals courts look at the record with very specific biases is a strong word, but they look for certain markers, right? So one of the things that is important to them is if a jury has the opportunity to weigh credibility, an appeals court is loath to overturn that. And in this case, you have a very interesting credibility issue. Richard Allen's own words, his own confessions. The fact that the jury convicted with those confessions, whatever you think about them, whether you think they were legitimate, whether you think they were the result of torture, the jury heard them, the jury heard those arguments, and the jury found those confessions to be credible. And an appeals court can basically say, look, you wanted to put your Odinism on, fine. Let's say you should have been able to do it. That's not the end of it. You also have to look at prejudice. And what you can say is, even if the jury had heard your Odinism theory, giving it all the credit it deserves, they also would have heard Richard Allen's own words, saying that he did this, providing details that only the killer would have known. And we know that they gave credit to those because they convicted him. And I think you're going to see something like that from the court when they write it. They may not even directly address the third party thing. A lot of times what a court will do is say, look, even assuming you're right, you still lose for all these reasons.
And part of the reason.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Reason is the jury doesn't have to say. The jury's free to talk. I don't know Indiana specific law, but before deliberations, before a verdict, they can't talk to anybody, right? But afterwards, it's up to them whether they want to talk to the press. But the jury never has to explain its verdict. The verdict form is very clear. There are 2 boxes, guilty, not guilty, next to each charge. So I haven't seen the verdict form, but I assume there are 4 charges, and then you just check a box, guilty, not guilty for each. And that is it. You do not have to explain which particular pieces of facts help support which elements. That's why jury nullification is a thing. The reason a jury can nullify, and what jury nullification means is to not follow the letter of the law, is because the jury does not have to explain its reasoning whatsoever. And this is part of our judicial system where they get to take in all of these facts. That's why they deliberate in secret, because whatever goes on in the jury room, it's for them to decide. And they decide how they're going to come out in each of these things. And that's why when on appeal, the judge isn't going to try to get into the jurors' minds of how they decided certain things. They're going to look at the record and see if it supports it.
Another thing about this, as Alice was saying, the jury never has to explain their verdict. And one of the reasons you should not testify at your trial is because if you testify in your own defense and you are convicted, an appeals court will say the jury heard the defendant's testimony and still convicted. They could have convicted on that basis alone. And that basically undermines all your other potential defenses. You know, you may have great claims and other things, but because the jury heard from you and could have rejected you and decided based solely on listening to you that you're guilty, a lot of times an appeals court will say, doesn't really even matter, this other stuff, because you testified and the jury obviously disbelieved you. This is not a testimony situation. He did not testify, but I think his words are similar, in a similar vein, because the jury was hearing it, because it was contested so vigorously by the defense. I think the jury could say, based on that alone, they're going to convict him. But they also have the other evidence, and we talked about this before. I mean, we focused so much on the confessions, and I remember when we did Murdaugh, we said Murdaugh testifying in some ways, in sort of this backwards way, was good for him because we were so focused on Murdaugh and what he said on the stand. And was he believable? And do you think he's telling the truth? Or can you buy what he's saying? We were so focused on that we were forgetting about the recording. We were forgetting about the timeline. We were forgetting about all that evidence that would lead you to think he did it. Similar thing here. Because Richard Allen confessed, and we spent so much time on the confessions and so much time on his psychiatrist and watching videos of his treatment in prison and all this other stuff, we were really focused on that, and we forgot about all the evidence that was the basis for the arrest before they had any of these confessions. I mean, there was a time where they were going to go to trial based on what they had without any confessions. And the things like the fact multiple witnesses saw Bridge Guy and saw nobody else that looked like him out there on that trail that day. The fact that Richard Allen put himself there at the time he needed to be there, and then, oh, by the way, when he realized that was a problem, changed his story, a change which was undermined by video of his vehicle arriving at the trail at exactly the time he initially said he got there, the bullet that cycled through his gun. These are all things that were damning for him. The video, the enhanced video. We talked to Kevin and Anya about this yesterday. The video, some people we went through this weird phase in the middle of the trial where people were trying to say Bridge Guy is irrelevant. He just happened to be right there while the girls were getting kidnapped and murdered by somebody else. But it sounds like if you actually saw the video, and we have not, and people have asked questions about the evidence and whether or not it will be available, it will be generally available. These things will all be a matter of public record. There will be transcripts. Not all the evidence will be available, obviously. The really sensitive stuff that should not be public, which unfortunately is to some extent, will remain under wraps, but you're going to see and hear probably everything else at some point. And obviously, look, the number of documentaries and everything else that will be made about this case, there will be no limit to them. But all that evidence was still there, whether or not you had the confessions or not.
You don't get inside the jury's head. The jury never has to explain what they do. And because of that, it's the totality of the circumstances, which is why, by the way, when you're the prosecution, you lay out such a fulsome case. You don't know what's going to resonate with the jury, but also on appeal, you want to give lots of avenues in which to let the jury reach the verdict, because this is kind of a choose your own adventure, right? There's not like one specific path where it's like the best kind of case doesn't just give you one piece of evidence for every element of the crime. It would be great if you had like a dozen reasons to find for each element of the crime, because then on appeal, the judge is like, there's so many different points that the jury could have latched onto in order to find support for the verdict.
Yeah, and we can talk more about this. I'm sure people will have questions, but I want to make sure to point out some real heroes in this case. I think the Delphi Police Unified Command, they have obviously received a lot of criticism. When you go into a trial, if you're a cop, you're going to be criticized. Every single thing you do and did will be scrutinized and criticized. And in this case, you'll be called Odinist. You'll be accused of framing people, of planting evidence. All that's going to happen to you. But I think what we actually have in the real world, not in the true crime world, but in the real world, you have a group of people who, Carter, Superintendent Carter on down, who promised that they would not stop until they solved this case, and they didn't. They fought for years for these girls. When people like me, I won't loop Alice in, wondered whether this case would ever be solved or whether they would ever make any progress, they kept going, and they saw their promise through to the end.
And let me say something on this, because it was kind of made an issue in opening and closing statement, but there was nothing in between by the defense about the FBI stepping out of the case. The fact that the FBI stepped out of the case is merely administrative. There was nothing going on in the case as we saw from trial. It was essentially a cold case until a volunteer found that the Richard Allen tip was kind of misclassified by name, right? What is that, 2022? It was 2022, right? So 5 years after the case. Essentially, the case was cold for about 4 years. After they ran down all the leads in 2017, there was nothing. And so when there's nothing going on in a case, because there are active murders and abductions and terrible things happening, resources of law enforcement get diverted away to more pressing matters, right? Cases, the longer a case is sitting, the less likely it's going to be solved. So they're going to redirect their efforts to a case that just happened in hopes of solving that case. So the FBI was like, you don't need our ballistic services. You don't need our DNA testing services. We've done all the autopsies. There's nothing for us to do. So instead of resting on our laurels over here, we're going to redirect our resources elsewhere. It was not a get out of Dodge FBI situation. But let me tell you, what Brett just said is totally true. So when other law enforcement entities that came in to help start stepping away because essentially they're signaling the case is cold, it is very easy for that case to lose momentum and for the jurisdiction who holds that case to say, we're going to put it into our cold case files because we do have so many other cases we need to pursue. That's not what happened here. They continue to have volunteers, staff, over and over and look through thousands of pages of tips and following up, looking at the same thing that they thought they would see nothing new in over and over, despite basically everyone agreeing that it was a cold case. So if anything, the fact that the FBI stepped out of the case shows that the case was cold, but that Indiana State Police and Delphi, they didn't stop pursuing this case. And this is like against all odds. 7 years out for this case to be solved is phenomenal. And it was because of them keeping pressure on it, keeping attention on it, the families keeping attention on the case. And I think a lot of coverage as well. Good and bad comes from true crime coverage, but I think the attention kept on the case allowed this case to have the inertia despite it essentially hitting a stone wall.
And I think Nick McClelland, the prosecutor in this case, deserves a lot of credit as well. Before this trial began, there was lots of speculation. There were whispers, there were rumors about how the prosecution weren't prepared, didn't know how they were going to prosecute this case, and all this other stuff. And it's unfortunate that you did not get to see this. I mean, I'm definitely of mixed emotions about the fact this trial wasn't televised, because given the circus that some people made this case into, I'm kind of glad it wasn't. But I am sad that you didn't get to see McClelland put on this case, because we just watched the Karen Reed case, and bless those prosecutors too. But that case, the way it was presented was problematic. It really seems like, based on the coverage of this, that the prosecution in this case had a tight, focused case where they laid everything out in a way that really made sense and that built a beautiful circumstantial case, laid a foundation and built on that. As Alice said, built those bookshelves and then filled them up with evidence.
And what was stark to me is I'm sure the prosecutors in this case, just like the defense in this case, are very aware of the media attention and all that's being made and said and commented on this case. And they've probably heard it. The difference between the two sides is you can be aware of what's being said about your case, but not be distracted by it. Based on what the prosecution presented at trial, which was exactly the type of case they needed to present. Clear. Everyone could understand the case. They probably were aware of the conspiracy theories. They had to have. Some of it made it into the filings, like the Odinism theories. But they weren't distracted by what people were saying online and what people were saying on YouTube channels. And they just kept their focus and prosecuted this case like it was any other case, which they needed to do. And I think because of that, you didn't get confusion among the jury. It was a very, very clear case. I used the word, and I hated using this word a couple episodes ago, saying this was an ordinary case. It's never ordinary when 2 young girls are brutally murdered. But it's ordinary in the sense that this is a straightforward case, and the evidence is there. Once they cracked open the case, once they, found the tip in 2022 and they plowed forward, it was a straightforward case in that the evidence was all there for them. And if it was prosecuted right, it should have resulted in a guilty verdict. And that's exactly what the prosecution did. They didn't get distracted by the media. They didn't get distracted by kind of shenanigans happening that had nothing to do with the merits of the case. And they kept their eye on the ball, which was to get justice for Abby and Libby. And they kept the focus on the victims, and they kept the focus not on anger towards Richard Allen, but always on justice first for the victims. Those kinds of prosecutors, I think it really comes to the jury that there's not some vendetta against the defendant. Anyone can be that defendant seat as long as it's the right guy. What we care about is bringing that person to justice for the horrific murders that they did. And that's what they did here. So that was one thing I wish I could have seen, because it seemed like it really came through in the prosecution's presentation. But note the difference in how the media circus affected each side of the case here.
And then there's the family of the girls who never, ever lost hope. Becky Patty is like America's grandmother. You want someone like her on your side. And she fought for these girls, and she fought for them. Look, I can't imagine that anybody wants to go to CrimeCon when your two little girls have been murdered. I don't think that Kelsey German wanted to go to CrimeCon when there were people out there accusing her of being involved. But they went, and they were there, and they fought for their girls, and they kept the story out there, and they kept the focus on the story. And I don't think the ISP ever would have given up on this case, but they weren't going to let them give up on it because they stayed on top of it. And Abby's family doesn't get mentioned as much, but they were there too. And they were there in the court, and they were testifying for their girls. And they are very strong, much stronger than I would have been.
I think that's exactly right. While we all may feel incredible relief that justice has been done today, it doesn't change the reality of what their family faces every day, which is that they don't get to live each day with their daughters and their granddaughters and their sisters. And that is a travesty. And so while the relief ends for us, right, that the trial's over and this was the result that we thought the evidence pointed towards, remember that. There is never ultimate relief for the family. They now get to be vindicated that they've taken one monster off the street, and he cannot do this to another girl, because I think with the viciousness of this crime, he dreamed about it for a long time. This was not going to be the last time he did something like this. And because of their persistence, this monster will not recreate this tragedy for another family. But we've lost 2 young girls who, by the way, they've been heroes always, and they are heroes to this day. If we didn't have that video, not that we couldn't convict, but it made it so compelling because the girls knew what was happening, and they captured it. They did all they could to help law enforcement solve it, just like McClellan said in his closing, and I think that's absolutely true. They did their part. and they are heroes. And so remember that when, we're cheering about this, lives are forever changed on all sides. Richard Allen's life has changed forever. Now, he chose this path, so I feel no sympathy for him, but he has ruined the lives of all of his loved ones as well. But also remember that this one day relief for us does not mean the end of just a horrible tragedy for Libby and Abby.
Yeah, and the family, for 7 years, they've been driven by seeking justice. And today, I'm sure they feel immense relief and joy, but tomorrow will come, and this doesn't bring the girls back, and now they have to live the rest of their lives. And it's going to be a huge challenge for them, and I hope that the people who've supported them will continue to support them. We've talked before about how to keep the memory of Abby and Libby alive. There's the Abby and Libby Memorial Park, which you can find online, which is taking donations. I believe there's also a scholarship fund, which as soon as we get information about that, we'll be sure to share with all of you. But this has been a long time coming.
Absolutely. And one just procedural thing, I've seen a lot of questions like, why isn't the gag order lifted? What is it about sentencing? Procedurally, the verdict is a big deal. The trial is a big deal. We have a verdict now. There are a lot of post-trial motions that are going to be filed. Do not freak out when you see a bunch of motions filed. That is always the case. This district court case is actually not even final yet. He has to be sentenced first, and then there's a final judgment in the case before any appeals can take place. So procedurally, this case still has some time to go, and it is not over by the standards of the court. So a verdict is a big deal, but it is not the end of this case. So when you see additional action, it's clickbait. They're not overturning the verdict. It's too early for that. There's not even a final judgment in this case. I would be shocked because of all the reasons we said at the beginning of this episode if this verdict is ever overturned. And it's in huge part because the prosecution put forth such a strong, tight case, and it was efficiently and well run by Judge Gull. And the defense asked for a lot of things to be on the record and in writing that it ties their future arguments. So they are bound by a lot of the things that have already happened so far. So that's all to say. Today is a big day. It's not the end of this case, but also be wary of any additional news you may see in the coming months that say, verdicts revisited, etc., something like that. So I don't think that will be the case. But thank you guys for joining us on this journey. I mean, this is one of the first cases we covered, and we feel very, invested in this case for many reasons. Probably like many of you, we want to live in a world where monsters like Richard Allen don't exist, but the reality, based on our own personal experience in law enforcement, is they're all too common. This is but one of so many cases. And the more we know how to look out for our community members and to look out for people who look like the rest of us, who live among us, who could be monsters who are just hiding behind a corner waiting to devastate lives. But with stronger communities, I think we can really be a protection for our community against these types of monsters. And today, there's one fewer monster on the street.
And I think Alice is right, and we all enjoy true crime. We're all here for a reason, but at the bottom of all of this is the pursuit of justice. And justice is not just about bringing vindication to a victim. It's also about protecting all of us. And we have to, monsters like this can't be on the street. Richard Allen was a dangerous man. I think he built up to this over a long period of time. If he had been released, if he had not been convicted, I shudder to think what he would have done. And that's why we have to, it is fine to reserve judgment, to, innocent until proven guilty, to want to see all the evidence come in. But as we've said several times, once it's in, you have to have the courage to change your mind. or to let yourself accept that someone is guilty. And sometimes in true crime, we just have all these people who it's like they can never, as long as they don't have a guy to focus on, they're all about justice. We want justice for the girls and we got to find who did this. But then when we have a person, it's like, well, now that we have a person, I just don't know. I don't know that I could vote to convict. And, you see that so often. You have to have the courage to evaluate the evidence and do the right thing.
And just because we all know it's coming, this is my plea to all the funders out there who fund all the media of these documentaries. Please don't make a Richard Allen is guilty or wrongfully convicted documentary. Please take those funds and help go solve another case. I really mean that. This case, there's been justice, thank God. We don't need to waste money on people who are very clearly guilty in an entertainment way. He's entitled to the appeals that he wants. Let him have those. But don't click on those documentaries. Don't read those stories. And read the court filings. They're all in writing. They're fantastic court filings in this case. But don't give money to the people who want to just throw money at the innocent camp or the wrongfully convicted camp for this case. Direct those funds to worthy cases. There are so many tragedies like Libby and Abby's that are unsolved as well. Let's go make a difference in those cases instead of digging a hole that doesn't need to be dug here. Wow. Thank you guys for joining us on literally no notice. And I just, everyone who's been covering this case, who's been waiting in line to get in to give us coverage, I appreciate their time because I know it was really difficult to be able to get information to the outside world. We did not sit in the courtroom at any point, but we benefited from their reporting. And we hope that we've been able to give a little insight on the procedural posture of this case. And for one, I'm so deeply relieved for Libby and Abby, and I thank them for, letting us talk about their case in order to make much bigger points about true crime, about the judicial system. And I hope this is a turning point for conspiracy theories of, the cops are always wrong, prosecutors are always crooked, whatever is coming out of this case. I hope this shines such a light on what good prosecution and what good investigation and what good family members and community members can do in a case to bring justice when there's been a horrible tragedy. Thank you guys for following along with us. And Brett, do you have any last words on this big day?
I just want to echo something you said earlier. The girls solved their own murder, and they were so brave. And I think that's something that should never be forgotten.
Amen to that. Well, to Abby and Libby's family, we continue to think about you because we know that this is just a new chapter in your grief. And thank you guys for allowing us to be part of this journey. And until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutors Legal Briefs. Thank you guys for your thoughts and prayers. For those who may not know, I had a baby last week, and he is very cute. He's still in the NICU. We are hoping we get to bring him home this week. So that is the hope. But all of you NICU parents, Brett included, unless you go through it, you just don't know what it's like. So you guys are incredible because it is a special kind of struggle where you literally have no control, and we just really appreciate everything about each day of your health and whatnot. So I really appreciate being here with you guys, but he's doing so much better. It was really, really rough at the beginning, and I'm sure many of you have been through that same thing, but it was not fun to kind of live hour by hour. But now we're no longer living hour by hour. We're just waiting for the days until we can come home.